Hello and welcome to the Microbiome Medics Podcast. I'm Dr. Siobhan McCormack.
And I'm Dr. Sheena Fraser, and we're your co-hosts.
We are both GPs and lifestyle medics with a shared passion for microbiome science. And we have spent the last 5 years deep diving into the world of the gut microbiome. We'll be translating the evidence and packaging it into actionable, bite-sized chunks so that you could harness the power of the microbiome to improve your own health and that of your patients.
Just before we start this interview, we'd like to remind our listeners to take a look at the Gut Microbiome for Clinicians course. It's available through bslm.org.uk. It's a comprehensive course on the gut microbiome, which takes you from the basics to the clinical application of this fascinating new area of medicine. This course will empower you to use microbiome science in your daily practice. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Microbiome Medics Podcast. I'm Dr. Sheena Fraser, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Dr. Holly Wilkinson. She's a microbiome scientist and a senior lecturer at Hull York Medical School with a PhD in the field of skin and wound healing. And she's going to talk to us today about the importance of the skin microbiome in health and disease. So hello, Holly.
Hi, Sheena. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me on the podcast.
No problem. It's so lovely to have you here because we haven't really covered the skin so far. And actually, skin is quite a passion of mine because after I finished my GP training, I went back to hospital medicine for a little while and I did a 6-month post in dermatology because I realized that about 20% of the work we see in general practice is actually dermatological. And prior to that, I hadn't really had any good dermatology training. So I did 6 months in dermatology and actually loved it. I started doing minor surgery and I brought my skills back to general practice. I did another 9 months of clinical assistant work in dermatology. And I've used my skills in general practice ever since. And I've always had that interest in dermatology. So when I started looking into the microbiome and what the skin microbiome is like, as well as the gut microbiome, I realized that, this had a lot of influence in the way we should be considering how we treat the skin and how we do things. So I'd really like to hear your perspective on this. So before we start, perhaps you could talk about where you've come from and how you got into the skin microbiome, just so that you can set the scene for us.
Yes, well, I actually began my career in a very different area of science. So I was working originally in the field of evolutionary biology, and then I ended up taking quite a serendipitous path to my current area of research. So I was lucky enough to be offered a job around kind of 10, 15 years ago when I was working at the university as a laboratory technician. And here I worked on a collaborative project with an industry partner initially, where we were testing antimicrobial wound dressings. So this was my first experience of the world of bacteria and wounds and infection. And at the time, it was all about kind of developing the most potent treatments possible to kill all bacteria. We saw all bacteria as being bad, and it took a while for us to be able to shift that mindset and start to understand that we have this living microbial ecosystem that generally lives in harmony with our skin. So then, kind of following this work, I obviously became very interested in the skin. So during my PhD, I learned more around the fundamental biology of the skin, and I focused on research, understanding how the skin repairs itself following injury, and also finding out key mechanisms to explain why wound healing is impaired in the elderly and diabetic. And now we're only just, beginning to appreciate that the microbiome is a key mechanism in this, which we'll obviously talk about in more detail later. And then finally, when I became an academic around 4 years ago, this is really where I kind of brought together all of my research experience and started to understand how the microbiome is linked to skin aging, wound healing, and various other kinds of cutaneous pathologies.
Excellent. That's really, really interesting. So before we get into all the depths of your research, could you just talk us through what the skin microbiome is? Because Shiv and I are always talking about the gut microbiome, and that you've gone into lots of depth into that over the last year. But I think the skin microbiome we haven't really touched upon. And can you explain to the listeners what it is and how it differs from the gut microbiome, and really what makes it so important?
Yeah, so the skin is quite a unique area compared to other areas of the body, such as the gut, in that it is obviously externally facing, and it's an incredibly harsh environment for microbes to live in. Because obviously if it wasn't, then we would be exposed to infections constantly. And it's also a very challenging area to research because there is much lower microbial mass in the skin than there is in the gut. So we have to use very, very sophisticated sequencing techniques to be able to identify the microbes in the skin and also understand what they're doing. And skin is harsh for microbes because it is highly acidic, and the food sources there are very limited, relative to the gut. So the microbes that live on our skin really have to be very highly adapted to the environment. And the way that the skin microbiome is made up in everybody is that we generally have what is called a core microbiome. So this is dominated by major types of bacteria such as Staphylococcus, Corynebacteria, and Cutibacterium. And these core skin microbiota don't really change all that much between individuals. They're relatively stable as well, so they can deal with small fluctuations due to the environment. But then everyone also has what we call a transient microbiome as well. So these are bacteria that they come in, they hang around for a small while, and then they disappear again. And this includes microbes that we would consider to be pathogenic or opportunistic. So they're coming in, looking for opportunities, realizing that there aren't opportunities, and then leaving again. But what's particularly interesting about the skin is that the proportions of different types of bacteria really depend on body site location, which correlates with the environmental conditions of those different body sites. So the proportions of bacteria that you have on your face will be different to the proportions that you have on your feet, as an example. And what we tend to see is, if we look at Cutibacterium, that's really a very lipid-loving bacteria. So that'll be in areas of your body where you have lots of sebaceous glands and sebum, such as the face, the upper back, the chest. And, when we're thinking about acne, they're obviously the areas that are very oily, and they're the areas where you're going to find a lot of Cutibacterium. And then areas that are very moist, such as the armpit, dominated by bacteria such as Staphylococcus and Corynebacteria, because this is where those bacteria are adapted to be using the substrates that are in the moist environment, such as the salt and the sweat. Now, I think when we think about what a healthy microbiome is, this is quite challenging. And I don't think that there is a defining definition to say this is what a healthy microbiome is. Everyone is different. We all live in different biogeographical locations. We use different skincare products. We have different hygiene practices. But I think there are generally a few factors that are true regardless of the situation. So one of those is that the core skin microbiota is relatively stable, which I mentioned earlier. It returns to its normal state. After you wash your hands, it depletes the microbiome, but that comes back quite rapidly. And number two is usually that if you have an issue in the microbiome, that is usually because there is some kind of perturbation in the skin already. So this could be that there are changes in the hydration, texture, or pH of the skin, which could be caused by aging or skin pathology. Or it could also be a situation where you have a breach to the skin barrier. So again, this could be linked to a skin condition like acne or eczema, or it could be because of a physical injury to the skin. I think the key message here is that if you want to really maintain a healthy skin microbiome, then you need to maintain good skin health. But likewise, if you have a perturbed microbiome, or what we call microbial dysbiosis, then this could also be driving or contributing to exacerbating an existing skin condition.
Okay. So when we talk about the gut microbiome, we quite often talk about the gut wall and the barrier there, and how important that wall is in terms of the development of disease and everything. And obviously the skin microbiome, has a barrier. that obviously isn't microbial, but very, very important as part of the story of the skin microbiome. So can you talk about the skin barrier and how that differs to, say, the gut wall, and how that is it dynamic the way the gut wall is, or is it something that is fairly static and always keeps everything out? And what happens to that over time?
Yeah, so the main difference is obviously we're looking at dry versus wet epithelia, because the gut is kind of a wet epithelia, whereas the skin is a very dry epithelium. And the top layer of the skin, what we consider to be the skin barrier, is actually a layer of dead cells. So they're not viable. And it's kind of a brick and mortar kind of structure. So we have all of our dead corneocytes, and in between all of those dead corneocytes are lipids that kind of help glue everything together like a cement. So it really acts like a physical, strong barrier against the external environment. And the dynamic component of it really is the underlying cells in the epidermis, the keratinocytes, because their role is to constantly replenish that barrier. So they're constantly proliferating and differentiating up through the skin to replace those shedding dead corneocytes. In terms of kind of the links between the crosstalk between the microbiome and the skin barrier, most of that is regulated by the immune cells that live in the skin. So they act as sentinels, and they're kind of always patrolling and looking for any problems with the skin barrier. But it is also regulated by the keratinocytes themselves. So the epidermal cells can also sense and respond to the bacteria there. But I would say that generally the dynamic component of the skin is less so the homeostasis and more so if there is something like a breach to the barrier. So that's where kind of all the reprogramming mechanisms are put into place, and the ability of the skin to regenerate, and activate. That's when all of that happens.
Mm. And so how much are the microbiota in the skin, the microorganisms, how much are they playing a role in that barrier?
So the way that the general microbiota that we're kind of thinking of as the commensal microbiota that are really good for the skin and kind of help to maintain the skin barrier, there are a few things that those microbiota can do. So one is that they already exist in the environment. So it's very hard then for a pathogen to come in and gain a foothold, because they act as a kind of a physical barrier that they're competing with pathogens for food sources that they're highly adapted to being able to take away from the pathogens. So they can prevent colonization with pathogens by just their presence. But then also the different commensal bacteria can also produce factors that really help the skin. For example, Cutibacterium, which we find in those sebaceous sites, it's obviously a lipid-loving bacteria, and it breaks down lipids, but it can also signal to keratinocytes to make them produce more lipids. So it's really important for hydration of the skin, as an example. And that hydration of the skin is also, again, important to prevent pathogens from invading, because it maintains that skin barrier as part of that cement and that kind of brick and mortar structure. They can also, the commensal bacteria, can also produce antimicrobials themselves. So when we think about antimicrobials, we tend to think about things that we're putting on the skin to prevent pathogens from growing, but the natural bacteria that live on our skin also produce factors that can kill pathogens. So Cutibacteria, Staphylococcus, they've all been shown to produce things that can actually prevent pathogens like Staphylococcus aureus, the bacteria we associate with MRSA, from being able to colonize the skin. So they play a wide range of roles really in preventing that pathogen colonization and kind of maintaining that skin barrier.
Yeah. And what about, because a friend of mine who's a herbalist would tell me that, you shouldn't put anything on your skin that you're not prepared to eat. Because of course the skin does allow a certain amount of substances to be absorbed. How is that regulated by skin bacteria? So in terms of kind of skincare, the skin bacteria can actually utilize some of the products that we find in skincare. So, for example, ceramides that are obviously a huge component of modern day skincare.
So bacteria can utilize those substrates, and then that helps them to produce more lipids. So when we put ceramides on our skin, not only are the ceramides having a direct positive influence on maintaining moisturization of our skin, but our commensal bacteria can utilize the ceramides themselves as a nutrient source. There's also been studies to show that hyaluronic acid, another example of a humectant that obviously helps to maintain hydration of the skin, has a positive effect on the microbiome. So it can actually reduce pathogens on the skin like Staphylococcus aureus and promote kind of diversity of the skin microbiome. So I think when we're thinking about what we're putting on our skin, I think we do need to kind of consider the effects that those products are having on the skin microbiome as well, because obviously they will have a direct effect on our skin, but we also need to consider their effects on the skin microbiome. And I think we need to start to shift thinking a little bit, because the way that we think about the skin and the microbiome is we think of them as two separate entities, when actually when we talk about skin, we should automatically think of the microbiome as being a component of the skin.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think this has kind of been the missing link with a lot of, when we think about a lot of disease processes in general, we're thinking pathophysiology, we're thinking biochemistry, all these things, all these processes that are happening, but we're not considering how the bacterial population or the viral population or, all the other microorganisms that are in the vicinity, how they're influencing that physiology. And I think that's key. So it's, what's really interesting for me is, I was reading a book and it was talking about Amazonian tribes. And when there was a microbiome scientist that went out to actually, live with the Amazonian tribes and study them. And one thing that they noticed was that their skin was perfect. They didn't have a lot of skin diseases the way we have in the West. So, things like eczema, psoriasis, acne, these weren't things that they suffered from. And their skin, it didn't require a lot of care. So, the Amazonian tribes are not putting a lot of creams and potions and lotions on their skin. They're washing in local streams, and they're not applying any moisturizer or anything like that to their skin. And the book that I was reading was talking about how the population of bacteria was much more diverse and much richer on the skin of the Amazonian tribes. And they had bacteria that we don't have in the West on their skin. Bacteria, for example, that can eat the ammonia when we sweat, that can take away the sort of sweaty smell from us. And the poor scientist from the West was belittled by them over there because he was very smelly in comparison to their population. But I found that really, really interesting. So how has our microbiome formed and developed, and how have we gone so far from that original hunter-gatherer microbiome to what we have now in the West?
Yeah, so I think I'll begin by answering the question about the development of the microbiome and then come back to the Amazonian research because it is very interesting. So the way that our microbiome develops is that it is seeded at birth. So once we are delivered through the birth canal, our initial skin bacteria is actually vaginal bacteria from our mothers. But obviously this can be affected depending on method of delivery. So there are lots of studies comparing vaginal versus cesarean delivery and how that affects not only the skin microbiome, but also how that affects the gut microbiome as well. But I think there's a lot of controversy in those studies to understand the potential impacts of those different microbiomes on later life. But initially, a baby's skin is colonized with the mother's microbiota, and this generally has high proportions of bacteria that we associate as being in the vagina, such as lactobacillus and Prevotella. And there's also fungal species there as well, like Candida albicans. So a lot of what we're talking about is focusing on the bacteria, but obviously the microbiome also incorporates fungal species, viruses, archaea as well. And that initial microbiome is really important because it trains and educates the baby's immune system so that the immune system of the baby knows how to tell the difference between a good and a bad bacteria. And then In children, these microbial communities are very, very transient. So obviously in adults, we have this core, stable skin microbiota, but this changes in children throughout development as it differentiates and grows into what we know as being the adult skin microbiome. And there are a few kind of transitional stages in this as well. So one of the key ones is adolescence as an example, because this is associated with huge changes in hormones and sebum production, and then that obviously changes our microbiome. So children don't have a lot of Cutibacterium as an example, but adults do. And that transition tends to happen during adolescence. With the Amazonian tribes, I think those studies are really interesting because they allow us to characterize the skin microbiomes of these indigenous communities and gain some insight into what our skin microbiome would have looked like prior to industrial revolution and the use of antibiotics. So it's really allowing us to understand how modern civilization has altered our microbiome and the implications for this in health and disease. As you mentioned, the skin of the Amazonians harbours bacteria that have been lost in the Western world. So a lot of these bacteria are bacteria that we associate with the environment. So kind of soil bacteria, water from the rivers, bacteria from the rivers as an example. And it's likely that they are procuring some kind of key evolutionary advantage to these hunter-gatherer communities that we don't require now in our kind of industrialized environments. But what is really interesting from those studies, as you mentioned, is that increase in diversity and the fact that those communities are less prone to a lot of skin conditions. So it's likely that this information is going to help us in really understanding why we are now in this era where a lot of people are more prone to allergies, to acne, to asthma, for example. What I found really interesting in those Amazonian studies as well is that the researchers that were working on these hunter-gatherer communities showed that the microbiota from these communities harbours antimicrobial resistance genes. And I find this really interesting because these people are assumed to have never been exposed to antibiotics before. So it's suggesting that our microbiota already have these antimicrobial resistance gene reservoirs that are already poised to fight antibiotics, even pre-exposure to antibiotics. And obviously, this is huge in terms of medicine because obviously antibiotics have been an incredible development for modern medicine, but at the same time, we're now focused with this global health challenge of antimicrobial resistance. So to know now that our skin just naturally harbours these antimicrobial resistance reservoirs, it might help us to understand why we are developing such widespread multi-drug resistance across, lots of different strains of bacteria. And it's also interesting that as we get older as well, our antimicrobial resistance reservoirs increase. So it suggests that as we get older, we're more likely to develop an antimicrobial resistant infection just by the fact that the microbiota that live on our skin are naturally more resistant to those drugs that we're treating patients with.
That is really interesting, isn't it? And do you think there's any way that these populations have got exposure to antibiotics in some way or form? Through their diet or through their environment in any way? Because obviously the West has encroached on on the Amazon for a while.
So there's two kind of ways to think about it. So it could be through exposure to man-made antibiotics. For example, maybe the antibiotics that could have got into the watercourses is one example. Or obviously if lots of kind of researchers are going into these communities or kind of they're coming onto mainland and having access to things, then that might obviously increase the chance of being exposed to man-made antibiotics. But the other thing is also to think about the fact that we've developed antibiotics based on what we've learned from nature. So obviously penicillin was originally created from mold. So it could just be that there's a lot of similarities in the genes. So the antimicrobial resistance genes that are found in the people in the Amazon are not necessarily targeted against these man-made antibiotics that we've made, but they could just be natural antibiotic resistance genes that are produced by the bacteria against other bacteria. But they are so similar to the ones that we're looking at in modern bacteria that they actually would confer resistance to our modern man-made antibiotics.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And obviously these microorganisms are just changing and adapting all the time, aren't they? It seems to be important, therefore, if these Amazonians have a lovely, rich, diverse population of bacteria on their skin, and they don't really get skin disorders, then it appears to have a similar protective mechanism to what we think of in the gut microbiome. Greater richness and diversity gives greater resilience, and, it can rebound back after infections much more readily, and it can protect you from disease much more readily. So it seems to be a similar kind of story with the skin. But can you tell us, is that the case?
Yes. So I think a lot of what we're learning now in the skin, we're way, way, way behind what we know in terms of the gut. But I think for the skin, a lot of the time you can take lessons from the gut. And this is definitely one of those situations where what is happening in the gut is matching up to what we see in the skin. So having a rich and diverse population of bacteria appears to be important in the skin. And we do see reduced microbial diversity in the skin of people that we know tend to be more at risk of having skin infections or skin complications or impaired wound healing. So, for example, the elderly and diabetic have altered community structures in their microbiome. So they have less diversity, and they also have more presence of pathogens on their skin as well. And there's examples with atopic dermatitis as an example, where you see in atopic dermatitis that the microbiome shifts, and this shift correlates with whether there's a disease flare or not. So when there is a disease flare, you see that the diversity of the microbiome goes down, and there's an increased amount of pathogens like Staphylococcus aureus. And then when the disease flare goes down, the microbiome diversity goes up and returns to baseline. So there are these direct correlations between having that rich and diverse population of bacteria correlating with having a healthy skin environment. And we also know that, as we mentioned earlier, that the skin plays wide-ranging roles in maintaining an effective barrier, preventing those infections and disease. So having that resilience and having that high variety and diversity of the microbiome is really important.
Yeah. So on that, if we want a really rich, diverse population of bacteria, I mean, obviously we can't all just up sticks and go and live in the jungle. How can we do that in our modern lives? If we're living in the middle of the city, how can we diversify our skin microbiome?
So it's actually quite challenging at the moment because there's very, very little research into this area. So right now, it's hard to say how we can actually modify our microbiome. And the general consensus is if you have a healthy skin, then your skin is already going to have a healthy microbiome. And it's more that if you have issues with your skin, then we need to start looking towards how can we modulate the microbiome to improve the skin's health in those situations. So there are a lot of studies where, clinical studies now that are going through where they are trying to do things to modulate the microbiome, for example. So this can be via using prebiotics, probiotics, postbiotics, the main methods as well. So there are studies where they are transplanting commensal bacteria that we know are really good for the skin onto people's skin who have skin conditions. And that is fighting against the pathogens that are on the skin, and that's helping to improve the skin conditions such as acne. We know that people are also modifying the bacteria as well. So if we have a bacteria, we know that a certain factor is really good for the skin, then we can do genetic engineering of the bacteria to make them produce lots of that factor and then put that on someone's skin. So there have been studies in wounds where they have put, for example, lactobacillus, that they have engineered to produce factors that promote wound healing, and they've thrown the lactobacillus into those wounds. And then that has improved wound healing. It's combated those pathogens in those wound environments. So it's not something that we have available on the shelves to us right now, but probably in the near future, we will be able to start kind of pick and choosing these probiotic, postbiotic, various different microbiome modulating agents and putting those on our skin.
Interesting. So going back to your sort of wound healing, tell us about your current research and what it is you're finding when it comes to wound healing, because that's a really interesting area. I mean, everybody gets wounds. We all get them from time to time. We all want them to heal up really quickly. We don't want infections. We don't want horrible scars. So what are you finding with your research?
Yeah, so I think it's actually quite an under-researched area, wound healing. And I don't think a lot of people, if you say cancer to somebody, they know what a cancer is. But when you say chronic wound, people are a bit less sure, unless they've had a direct experience of a chronic wound, they're a bit less sure about what that actually is. But as you said, we're all getting injuries all the time. They are going to be prone to infections. We might go in for surgery and then think there's surgical site wounds that then need to heal as well. So it is a very diverse area. Burns are another type of wound. So it is something where we do need to be doing more research and understanding the role of the microbiome in various different types of healing processes. So the primary condition that my lab researches is these chronic non-healing skin wounds. They primarily affect the elderly and diabetic, and they can be pretty devastating for the patients that have those, because they're at more risk of amputations and sepsis and other types of infections as well. So what we're really trying to do is understand what is driving poor healing in these patients, so that we can both prevent these wounds from happening in the first place and also effectively treat them, because we don't really have very good treatments for these wounds. Most of the time, it's a case of sticking a wound dressing on and hoping it heals. So within this, our group is looking at the microbiome, and we're using DNA sequencing approaches to characterize the microbiome in elderly and diabetic people with and without wounds, so that we can understand what's different between healthy versus aged or the diabetic microbiome, so we can start to manipulate that and target it. We've also been profiling the microbiome of chronic wounds, and we've found that actually the microbiome profile of a wound upon presentation in the clinic can actually predict whether the wound will go on to heal kind of 6 to 12 weeks later. So that's really demonstrating that core microbiome is really, really important to determine whether a wound will heal or not. And it also suggests that hopefully sometime in the near future, we might also be able to use the microbiome as a predictive screening approach to basically identify those patients that are most at risk and be able to stratify them and get them the treatment that they need. So something as well that's really important in microbiome research, we talk about all these studies that everyone is doing, but a lot of these are correlative profiling studies. So you see that somebody has acne, you swab them, and then they show that their microbiome is different to someone that doesn't have acne. But obviously this is kind of just correlation, and we really need more studies that are taking a multi-pronged approach to understand what is driving those changes. Is it that the microbiome is changing and then driving acne? Is it that the acne is happening and then the microbiome is changing in response to that? So we're also now trying to make more suitable laboratory models to be able to investigate this, because in the skin community, because we are so far behind where we are in the gut, we don't have suitable models at the moment to be able to look at the role that the microbiome play functionally in the skin. So we've just received research to take some of our existing skin models for microbiome research and really kind of translate them and make them more clinically relevant. And then finally, if we just go back to wound infections and antibiotics. So we're obviously interested in looking just at the microbiome, but we're also interested in figuring out better ways to tackle infections. And one of those that we're working on is by developing microbial agents that just target specific pathogens. Because now we're starting to appreciate the microbiome is really important. Broad spectrum antibiotics can sometimes also be really bad for infections, because what can happen in those situations is the broad spectrum antibiotics kill the native microbiome, and then the only bacteria that's left in that environment is the antimicrobial resistant bacteria that then has no competition, and that can thrive really well. So we've been developing targeted antimicrobials that only kill Staphylococcus aureus, and some of our preclinical research has shown that we can use these targeted antimicrobials to just kill that pathogen, restore the natural skin microbiome, and then accelerate healing. So we're hoping that these kinds of studies that we're doing now will work their way through clinical trials and then eventually get to patients and then offer a valid alternative to current antimicrobial treatments.
I think that's really encouraging, actually, because that's what we worry about as doctors, as medics, that we're giving this antibiotic and the fallout from giving the antibiotic is that we're then knocking out all these beautiful, beneficial microorganisms that we're discovering are really, really doing a good job for us. And we don't want to knock out these populations. So I think that makes a lot of sense to be able to home in on the ones that are really causing the problem, the bacteria that are really problematic, and try to reduce that population. And I like also what you were saying before about using other bacteria to lower the populations, in the same way that we sort of use probiotic bacteria, to increase the richness and diversity of those populations of beneficial bacteria. And that then has that knock-on effect of knocking down the population of harmful bacteria in a very sort of antimicrobial way. So we're using the sort of antimicrobial properties of these very beneficial microorganisms. And, I've done that, through just using things like natural yogurt and things like this. But interestingly, I've used natural yogurt on my skin, occasionally when, around my eyes, interestingly, I had some blepharitis and it wasn't clearing with normal bathing. So I put natural yogurt in my eye, which is probably not the smartest thing to do, but it actually really cleared my eye up. And my thinking was to use those natural bacteria to outnumber the harmful ones that were driving the inflammation in my eye. And it certainly appeared to work. It was a wee bit stingy though. Maybe you should, the lactic acid in the yogurt was maybe a little bit acidic for my eye. But it was, I just did it as an experiment. I wouldn't recommend it to all the listeners, by the way. But are we at the stage where we could start using, these probiotic preparations? I know that there are companies out there producing probiotics for the skin. Could we start using things like this for wounds that are not healing, or for situations like that?
I think potentially in the future we will be able to. I think that what we really need is some kind of evidence-based research to demonstrate that this would be a good approach to take. As I said earlier, there has been some preclinical studies to show that probiotics can modulate the microbiome in wounds and then improve wound healing. And it seems like the most obvious path to take. But obviously a lot of these companies that are also developing these skin products that contain probiotics, postbiotics, are having to also deal with the challenges around being able to, for example, with probiotics, it's thinking about how do you formulate those probiotics? How do you kind of keep them alive in the formulation for people to be able to use and gain those benefits? So I think that's something that is kind of challenging in terms of the cosmetics field, is how to actually incorporate those into products that people can use and be able to demonstrate those effects.
And if we go to sort of skincare in general, since I learned about the skin microbiome, I have changed my skincare regime a little bit. I was quite perturbed that I might be knocking out a lot of the population of lovely bacteria on my skin through my use of soaps. And so I decided to stop using soap and see what happened to my skin microbiome and see whether or not I could tolerate not using soaps. And it's an interesting experiment, but I've actually not been using soaps on my skin now for around about 2 or 3 years now. And I only use shampoo still on my hair because I can't tolerate not having clean hair. And I couldn't persevere with that one. But I did find that it was quite interesting just going from using soap daily to not using soap on my skin, because I found that my skin did stop developing a lot of sort of very minor imperfections. I don't have a skin disease as such, but even just minor imperfections, little things, little spots, little seborrheic warts, these type of things. I haven't developed so many of these since I stopped using soap. And The other interesting thing for me was that I was always having to moisturize my legs because they were really dry all the time. And I haven't had to use moisturizer on them since I stopped using soap. So I've definitely noticed an improvement in my skin since I stopped using soap. So what do you think about that, Holly? Do you think that there's much evidence base for that? Or do you think we should still use soaps?
I think I kind of agree with you here in terms of kind of soaps and chemicals. I think the best way to think about kind of what is good for the skin is going to be good for the microbiome as well. So I think that's kind of, when we're thinking about soaps, if they're going to aggravate your skin, then that's obviously going to have an effect on your microbiome as well. And if you're using soaps that are stripping all of those natural oils, then that is going to have an effect on those commensal bacteria. So I do think that there is value in this, and it's kind of the same as your hair as well. You know, when you're talking about using the shampoos, you find if you're washing your hair more often, it gets greasier faster and faster and faster. Whereas if you kind of slow down on that, your hair balances itself and your skin balances itself as well. So I definitely agree that kind of moving away from those more harsh chemicals and products that are going to strip the skin of its natural oils, is obviously the way to go in terms of kind of maintaining that healthy skin and healthy barrier and also healthy microbiome. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, my skincare routine has also changed over time, especially as I've learned more around the microbiome and kind of moving away from those more harsh products. And I think, you know, it used to be when you were a teenager years ago, you'd be throwing all kinds of harsh chemicals on your skin to deal with your acne. And obviously that just aggravates acne. That just makes it worse. So anything where you can be reducing that stress in the skin is going to have a good effect, because inflammation is going to drive changes in the skin microbiome, and then that is going to aggravate the skin. I think there's also a lot of links between the gut and skin as well. So any type of gut inflammation or stress to the body is also going to have an impact on the skin. So maintaining good gut health is inadvertently going to be good for the skin health as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that. And interestingly, I've also found that moving to sort of more natural skin oils, you know, essential oils, seems to be much better at harmonizing the oil control on my face. And certainly I have a daughter going through puberty and getting acne in her skin. And actually when we changed to more natural skin products like face oils, just made from essential oils, we found that her sebum balance was much improved, and her skin was much improved on all the natural products. So I do wonder whether we should be adopting sort of more natural means with our skin a little bit more readily. And I'm interested also in the sort of phytochemicals that natural plant oils contain in comparison to things like mineral oil, and whether or not these are having an additional effect. Because I know that plant polyphenols and phytochemicals are utilized by the gut bacteria. And I wonder, is it the same in the skin microbiome? Do the skin microbiota utilize those phytochemicals, and is it beneficial then for them?
Yes, so it's the same in the skin. So the skin can utilize those chemicals, and the skin bacteria can utilize those chemicals, and then it can also then lead to greater production of ceramides, as an example, and other lipids to increase moisture levels and, you know, maintain the skin barrier. What's also really interesting is that a lot of those phytochemicals also incorporate things that are good for the skin separate to the microbiome. So they have lots of antioxidant properties. And we know that that's, especially in terms of skin aging, that's really important. We know that there are those links between skin aging and the microbiome. We just don't know kind of what is driving what. We don't know if it's the changes in, you know, more wrinkles means your bacteria are going to change, or your bacteria change and then drive more wrinkles. But definitely having access to more of those natural plant-derived products not only can have a positive effect on the skin microbiome, but it can have a direct effect on the skin. We work a lot as well separate to the microbiome, but they are probably linked, and we probably should be looking at this, is we work a lot on phytoestrogens and kind of those natural soy type products from plants, because we know, especially in women, when you go through the menopause, circulating estrogen drops. and that is directly correlated with skin aging. So as soon as a woman goes through menopause, their skin rapidly declines. They're more at risk of lots of different types of skin conditions. And you can actually reverse that. A lot of people obviously take HRT, and that kind of reverses that. But there are negative connotations with HRT. Some people are more at risk of cancer, etc. So by using those more natural phytoestrogens, that's one way of being able to get around that. But then also, thinking about the beneficial effects that those phytoestrogens could potentially have on the microbiome as well.
And can you, obviously you'd be ingesting most of those phytoestrogens through eating soy and things like that. Are there products for using phytoestrogens on the skin? Is there anything that you could apply to the skin directly that would help with the aging?
I'm not sure if there are any on the market at the moment. I think there are products that contain obviously the kind of the plant-derived phytochemicals, but I'm not sure if any of those are estrogen linked. But yeah, if you go to lots of different suppliers, you can find those kind of natural phytoestrogen tablets and things, and you can take those every day. I know a lot of people that do take those natural estrogens and soy-derived products purely for the beneficial effects that they have in terms of skin aging.
Interesting. And I also know that, in terms of skincare, a lot of people use things like natural yogurt on their face or kefir just on their skin as a sort of face mask type thing. I've got a good friend, Janice, who is my fermenting buddy, and she uses kefir on her skin, and she reckons that really improves her skin and is very anti-aging. And she has great skin. So I'm wondering how much is actually influenced by that, and whether you think that these bacteria in the kefir could have that impact.
I think definitely, because obviously in the gut, that fermentation process is really important. It generates lots of factors that are really important in terms of kind of dampening inflammation and protecting the body. So one of those main products that is produced during fermentation in the gut is butyrate. And there have been studies to show that butyrate, if you put butyrate on the skin, it also has those beneficial effects. And it's very, very recently been shown now that the bacteria that live on your skin can actually produce butyrate. So we didn't know that before. So there are things that are being produced in the gut by bacteria in the gut that actually our skin are also capable of producing through those same fermentation processes. And just to very quickly come back to those Amazonian tribes who have the brilliant skin and diverse microbiomes. So I went to the Amazon rainforest a very long time ago for completely different reasons. But while I was there, we walked through some of the tribes, and we had to drink these fermented liquid products that they had produced from kind of, fermenting sugars, etc. And I do wonder kind of if they're naturally consuming these fermented products as well, is that also have an effect on their health and their microbiome?
That's interesting, isn't it? I think a lot of the cultures that eat or consume a lot of fermented foods certainly tend to do well with longevity, don't they? It's really interesting. The other one that I'm wondering about that we've obviously been using in medicine for a while is raw honey. Interestingly, had a case very recently of somebody with a wound within the mouth, actually, that wasn't healing at all. And we tried all these sort of usual tricks that we have medically wise, and nothing was working on this. And it was a horrible ulcer. And my patient rather smartly got some Manuka honey and started applying the Manuka honey to it, and got complete clearance of this ulcer in her mouth within a week or so. And obviously with long-term wounds, like the ones that you were describing in the diabetics, these nasty ulcers in the lower legs that we see a lot, that just don't heal. We have used honey in these patients, and there are honey dressings as well. Do you know much about how honey is working and what that's actually doing?
Yeah, so honey is known to have natural antimicrobial and also anti-inflammatory properties. And there have been a lot of studies to show that can have that beneficial effect on wound healing. I think it's certainly, especially in certain people, it can have that beneficial effect. And there are these honey containing dressings available on the market. But I think the reason that they're not widely used clinically is, I think, partly because a lot of the time that clinicians are treating these patients, they're using the general standard products that they are being given and kind of not deviating from that. I think there's a lot of kind of socioeconomic considerations to take there as well. If they can use a much lower cost dressing, then that might be used instead. But then I think on the opposite side of that, you do have people that are just very recalcitrant. So even if you put something like a honey containing dressing on their wound, it might not have the effects that you would want it to have. Yeah. So I think kind of being able to have different options is useful. And I think maybe being able to do something where we are directly modulating the microbiome would potentially be able to deliver those positive effects as well. But yeah, honey is great for lots of reasons. I definitely recommend honey.
Yeah, and I'm really fortunate because my dad has lots of bees, and so we always have tons of raw honey at home. And yeah, I'm a big fan. So thank you so much, Holly. That has been really, really interesting for me. I thought I knew a bit about the skin microbiome, but I definitely know a lot more now. So thank you so much. You've really taught us a lot today, and I'm really interested to hear where your research takes you on this, because, I think we definitely need more scientists like yourself that can keep, pushing the boundaries of research and finding out more about what we can do to maintain these really healthy ecosystems. And I think this stuff should really be common knowledge for our clinicians as well who are working with skin. Is on that, by the way, is there anything that you're doing to get that knowledge base out to clinicians?
So at the moment, a lot of what I do is working kind of collaboratively with industry. So that's in terms of, because a lot of academia is very kind of insular, and we don't engage externally a lot of the time. So we are really trying to push that. And one of the ways is by kind of working more with industry partners so that we can develop more products that are evidence-based and will have those effects. We in our group as well, we work with the clinical departments at our institution. So we think that that's obviously really important to have those two-way conversations between what we're doing and the clinicians. And also bringing in patients into the discussion as well. So we do a lot of work with patients and public involvement to see what they're thinking about the research that we're doing. Because at the end of the day, there's no point doing some research and not thinking about the clinical side and what the patients think, and then getting to the end of that and then realizing that actually that treatment would not be practical for patients. So it's something that I think historically it was always ignored. And I think a lot of basic research was more, we're looking at this because we're interested in it. Whereas now I think it is moving more in a translational direction, and there is more of a kind of a push to be working more with patients, with clinicians, with industry as well, so that we can really develop those products that can actually make a difference.
Yeah. I mean, the products are one side of the coin, but as we already know with microbiomes, they need a natural approach too. And I think it's really important to go back to nature and appreciate, what nature does for our microbiomes. And as you say, living in the Amazon rainforest, having that exposure to soil, exposure to, natural, springs and things like that, that's something that, if we had better, less polluted countrysides and riverways, we could essentially have a more enriched microbiome from spending more time in nature. And I'm sure that if you compared skin microbiomes of nice organic gardeners like my parents and people who live in the city, you'd probably find big differences in their skin microbiome. See,
we have done a small amount of work on that actually. So we've compared kind of socioeconomic backgrounds. So we've swabbed skin from elderly people that are in socially deprived areas versus elderly people that are in more affluent areas, and they're going out and they're playing a lot of golf and keeping very active, and their microbiomes are completely different. So it's not just about the fact that you're going to get old and your microbiome is going to change. You can do things to prevent that from happening also from just like a health and environment perspective. So the microbiome of the elderly people that are more active and are living in those affluent areas mimics more of the microbiome that you see in younger people. Whereas the people that are living in those more socially deprived areas, they have more incidence of health problems. They're smoking. Their microbiome is the microbiome that is going to make you more susceptible to a chronic wound.
Okay, so lots of things that we can do essentially to enhance our microbiome just through our lifestyle, which is, what Shiv and I talk about all the time, really. And I think, that's an important message, if you have a skin disorder, or even if you don't have a skin disorder and you just want a really healthy skin microbiome, then, spend some time in nature, get out and exercise, meet friends, diversify your skin microbiome from getting out there and having lots of exposure to the natural environment, as well as eating a healthy diet and getting your sleep. All these things are important. So thank you so much. I think on that note, we've covered the skin microbiome pretty well today. Obviously, there's lots more we could discuss, and I would love to have some more conversations on other clinical skin disorders at some stage. But thank you so much, Holly. You've given me lots of your time today, and I've learned a lot. So thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you.